Right. So 1 year that I was there, I was in the influenza surveillance officer. And the next year I was sent out to the state of Washington work with the state epidemiologist and give the governor his flu shots. And once I got out to Washington, I never wanted to go back to the East Coast.
Uh-huh.
And I started flying seaplanes out here and having a wonderful time, and just had to stay here. I've been here ever since, except for my travels, which of course I've been to all 6 continents, all except Antarctica, and my travels, and had a wonderful time with that as well. But once I got out here, I finished my preventive medicine residency at the University of Washington. And during that time, I had a sickness of the soul, if you will. And I was very weak for about a year. And I was cared for by some friends. And when I got over that sickness, I suddenly came out of it. I became invincible. And I started 6 birth control clinics in Seattle because that was what I really wanted to do.
Uh-huh.
And having succeeded with that, I thought that was just normal, though, of course, but apparently nobody else was doing that. And so then I was invited to be associate medical director of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. So I traveled to New York and spent a year trying to persuade the board that, and everybody else, the staff as well, that abortion and sterilization should be a part of the mix at all of the 400, there were then 400 clinics around the country, Planned Parenthood. But nobody was paying much attention. At one point, my boss, Dr. Alan Goodmacher, said, "George, you may no longer speak to the board about this because you're causing a lot of disruption." I said, "What? I don't believe what I'm hearing. I'm an American doctor. I can talk to anybody I want." So he fired me. Well, the board was so upset with this that they did exactly what I wanted. They put abortion and sterilization in all 400 clinics around the country. And so that, as far as I'm concerned, is my greatest accomplishment. I did nothing and I accomplished everything.
Good for you.
Quite wonderful. And then also I left then New York, which was a hellish place to live anyway, and came back to the West Coast and lived happily ever after.
Well, then you still are. So what did you do when you came back?
I started my own nonprofit, Population Dynamics, which was a birth control clinic of mine, and taught 100 doctors how to do abortions and the 50 doctors how to do vasectomies, and practiced for some 20 years.
And where was that?
In Seattle.
In
That
Seattle.
Was in
Mm-hmm.
Seattle, yes. And this was, I was part of the family medicine department at the University of Washington, which is the best family medicine department in the country for the last 30 years.
Uh-huh. And then what? Somewhere.
Well, so that was my biggest accomplishment without question, because, and it wasn't anything that I had to do with. They did it to themselves in a way, by firing me, which was totally unjustified, and but it did the job. So it was nature at work, I think, really.
Uh-huh.
So then, and so I will say that practicing medicine as a nonprofit is a great way to practice medicine. I had a board. I was on a salary, and I had instead of having to pay huge amounts of taxes to the government, I was able to use that money to do all kinds of projects relating to the slowing down world population growth. Now, I must say that we haven't succeeded in that, since the population went from 2 billion when I was born to the current 8 billion, almost 8 billion.
Yeah.
But we did succeed in putting in place the means of slowing it down. And the best example of that is Europe, where all 17 of the major nations are declining in natural increase, but they're populations are growing because of in-migration. And if you leave out the migration factor, the reason that they're declining in natural increase is because women have access to birth control, and the sum total of their good decisions adds up to a decline.
Mm-hmm. So when did you get interested in circumcision?
Well, I did one circumcision as an intern and was horrified about it and never wanted to do another one. I was suckered into it by my residents, just the way doctors sucker parents into it. And but fortunately, for the following 20 years after that, I didn't have anything to do with it. But then I heard about some serious complications, and I realized what is going on here. This is not only harming the babies, but it's harming the medical profession. This is an outrage. This should never be done. And so the more I learned about it, the more involved I got. And then I realized that we had to fight fire with fire, that it was doctors of all people who were doing this, and the doctors had to fight back and fight them. So that's why we started Doctors Opposing Circumcision, which is another nonprofit.
What year was that?
1995.
And around the time that Marilyn was gearing up in Marin, or did she have any connection?
Oh yes, we've had close connections ever since, and absolutely, she's the mother of us all.
Yeah, yeah. So,
and in fact, this Sunday is her 80th birthday.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah.
I went to her 60th birthday 20 years ago with Rio Cruz. We drove up from Santa Cruz, so it's been 20 years. Wow.
I might have been there too. I'm not sure.
Possibly.
I was at one of her parties about that time.
So you're, how did doctors locally take to your starting this organization? What kind of flack did you get? Support did you get?
Well, I didn't really care. I'm self-sufficient. I don't care what other people think. If I did, I would not have accomplished what I have. So that any problems that they had with what I was doing was their problem, not mine.
Right. Well, that's what I think it's Byron Katie says, what other people think of me is none of my business.
That's right.
Few of us, we were so entrained. It sounds like you were fortunate in with the unconditional love that didn't affect you as much. But did you get a lot of people come on board and support the organization, or how did that grow?
Oh, indeed, we have members from every continent except Antarctica, and we've had tremendous support. But we haven't found a solution yet. I have always maintained that the solution is the law, because the problem is that doctors who are doing this are in a compulsive mode. They are victims of this procedure themselves in most cases.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, they have a compulsion to do it to others, just as pedophiles, priests have a compulsion to do it to others. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's worse than pedophilia because it tortures and mutilates the body, as well as psychologically harming the child.
Permanent physical change, yeah.
Yeah, so it just it has to be stopped. And the only thing that doctors will listen to is the law. And we are in the process of suing doctors for fraud. And I think that's going to be one of the most effective ways we've seen yet to stop this nonsense.
Now, is that the Ron Goldberg's project?
No, it's Professor Peter Adler has written a paper on the fact that it's totally fraudulent. And there are two kinds of fraud. One kind is hard to prove in the law. But the other is easier because doctors have a fiduciary responsibility to a patient, not to defraud them, you know, so they have to prove that they're not. And it's much easier to prove that kind of fraud. And that's what we're going after.
And where's this going to occur? Where's the?
Well, we don't know yet, but we have several other exciting cases on board at the same time. And so it's too early to say, perhaps.
I didn't know about this. Good work. Now,
Ron Goldman is suing in Massachusetts for, he's suing Medicaid for wasting their money on a totally unnecessary procedure.
Yeah.
That's going ahead first.
And I just saw the other day that with elective procedures discouraged with the COVID virus, that's another impetus to stop doing it now, for even if temporary, to get a foot in the door.
That's right. That's right. And we're putting out a press release on that very point.
Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna back up for a minute to your personal life again. And did you get married along the way? Have any kids?
I've been married twice. Both of my wives were goddesses. I had a wonderful time with both of them. My first wife was also involved with population issues. And I didn't marry her until I was 40 and she was 53. And she had 4 sons. So I now have 4 stepsons from them. And her name was Martha Kent Willing Denniston. And she is responsible, she was instrumental in the Mexico Miracle. The Mexico Miracle is where in 20 years, women went from an average of 5 children to 2 children. And the way it happened was that David Poindexter took radio soap operas to Mexico in the Spanish language, and the leading actors and actresses in Mexico put these on the radio and television, and the women said, "Oh my, we can control our fertility. We can have fewer children." And they said, absolutely. You know, they had all these shows that showed why they could do that. Well, Martha got the initial funding for that. She managed to spring it away from the Population Institute. David Poindexter was a part of that institute, and he wanted to go off on his own. But the leading person running that, Werner Fornos, a Prussian, a wonderful man, but a Prussian, wouldn't give the money, but she persuaded him to do that. And so David went off with some money and did the Mexico Miracle.
I'd never heard of that. That's wonderful.
Yeah, pretty amazing. And Martha passed away at the age of 83, and I then married I was then 75, and or 70, I was then 70. And then when I was 75, I married a lovely woman who was 85. And we had 5 wonderful years, 5 or 6, 7 years, wonderful years together. Mm. She has 2 sons in England and 2 in Australia, one in Sydney and one in Melbourne. And we went around the world and visited them all many times and had a wonderful time. And then she passed on at the age of 90. And so I have 8 stepsons altogether, and they're all wonderful and they're great fun.
Wow, 8 stepsons, and you didn't contribute to the population issue.
That's correct. Right. That's right.
Way to go, man.
It was nothing.
And do you have any love prospects now at 85?
Well, I love my second wife's family, and I see them all the time. They're in Seattle, so I have to commute from my home on the Olympic Peninsula. Of course, I'm not doing that now. We're all in isolation, but yeah. They're wonderful. And I have 2 lovely nieces that I see regularly, but it's all called off for the moment.
Yeah. Well, now that fills us in on your personal life. Because I was a pilot and always had a dream of having a lake amphibious, but my course in medicine didn't provide me with income to do that. But you flew 50 some planes, you said.
Yeah, the lake trifibian, by the way, the lake can not only fly in the air, but it can land on the water or it can land on the land.
Yeah.
Right, it's just an amazing plane. I've flown it and had a great time with it. Yeah, 52, Ty, I've flown balloons, hot air balloons. I've flown autogyros. I'm rated in autogyro. I've flown the Goodyear blimp. I've flown the Met Life blimp, and I've flown the Zeppelin that was flying around San Francisco for some years before it had to be sent back because they didn't have any sponsors. And so I got to fly all kinds of different things. Anything that flies, I love to fly. I've flown gliders. I'm a CFI in gliders, and have taught people to fly. Had a great time.
Are you still flying anything?
Well, I hope to go up shortly in a motor glider with some friends, but I'm not currently rated. I mean, I haven't been able to pass the medical recently.
Well, let's jump back. I wanted to ask how you and George Geisiger got together. John Geisiger got together. You're George, he's John. I know that's been quite a team.
Yes, well, he's been a wonderful asset to Doc. It was his choice to serve as the legal counsel and as our executive director, and he's done an amazing job. And I just very grateful to him for that. We've known each other for quite a long time. I knew his wife as well. She's a nurse who's also very supportive of our cause. And she's in fact on our board, as you know. Michelle Wetland is her name.
Yes, yes. Other personal connections over the years with the Intactive Network and memorable moments of confrontation or success, or what can you recall?
Well, I guess one of our big accomplishments there is the international symposia, which we've held every 2 years since the early 90s in some of the leading universities in the world, Oxford, Berkeley, and so on. And these symposia have drawn experts who have documented the harm of circumcision. And then we've published the books with the leading scientific publisher in the world, Springer. And they're there for all to see and to realize what an insane business this is.
Yeah, my first one was the Sydney Uni one in 2000, and you were probably there, but I don't know if we.
No, as a matter of fact, that was the only one I missed.
Oh.
Yeah, at that point, it seemed like a long way to go to Sydney, but then shortly after that, I have 2 sons there, so I came anyway. I missed that symposium, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been there several times to Australia, thanks to my lovely wife.
Yeah. And what other kinds of actions have you been involved in besides the symposia?
Well, Doc has tried to, deal with the issue. I think I have to say that John Geisiger has done the most work for that, but our executive vice president, as you may know, is Mark Reese. And Mark has the website for Brit Shalom.
Right, yes.
Brit Shalom tells Jews that there are several hundred rabbis, and there are probably a lot more who just haven't come out yet, Reform rabbis who are willing to do the ceremony without the cutting.
It's up to that number. I didn't know that.
Oh, yes. And in fact, yeah, and you can go to the website and find out where the nearest rabbi is to do that. But so if Jews are not forced to do this, then who is? I mean,
yeah.
Well, the Muslims think they are, but they're misinformed. And as usual, the thing may have started with some religious import, but then humans got a hold of it. And for example, when the statue of David by Michelangelo looks like he is intact.
Exactly. Yeah.
He probably is not. He probably had Brit Mila, which was just a tiny bit of the tip of the foreskin was cut off. And that was the norm. That was the norm until about the time of Christ. And then a bunch of rabbis got together and said, we want to be sure that this is more obvious, so we're going to take more off. And that was Brit Pariah, and that's been the case for the last 2,000 years. And so it was just any religion that did it. It was a bunch of people making this terrible, tragic decision to harm people.
And that was because they were competing in the games with Romans nude, and they didn't want to look like they were intact. So they wanted to stand out, I guess, and reveal the whole.
That's exactly right. Actually, I mean, I think the Greeks felt that if you had a foreskin, you were not nude, but if you had a exposed glands, tip of the penis, then you were nude. And if the Jews had bris pariah, then they could not pull the foreskin forward and tie it, and therefore they could not join the games. And that's what the rabbis were trying to accomplish, I think, which is bizarre. Anyway, the whole thing is bizarre and tragic that we have to waste our time stopping it.
Yeah, yeah.
But we will stop. We will stop it. I say to all those who circumcise, beware. Your time, you have tragically overstayed your welcome in harming little boys.
Yeah, yeah. I think we'll look back on that like leeches and bloodletting and radiating thymuses and a few other disasters that we've.
That's right. Matter of fact, you know, it is illegal in America right this moment, because when Pat Schroeder in 1997 passed the Female Genital Mutilation Act, it outlawed female genital mutilation. But the 14th Amendment says there cannot be discrimination on the basis of gender.
Yeah.
So therefore, little boys are covered, and it's not being enforced.
Exactly. Now, have you had any other interests in your long and varied career besides population control, circumcision, flying airplanes, finding goddesses and adopting their sons? What else? Other unusual things can we find out about you?
Well, I think I love to write. I've written a number of books. One is The Joy of Ballooning. And I must say that although I wrote the text to that coffee table book, the pictures in there are absolutely wonderful. And I got them. It took me 8 years to find a publisher. And during that 8 years at Albuquerque, I met these 4 wonderful people who were the world's greatest balloon photographers. And I said, if I ever get a publisher, I want your pictures. And so when I did get the publisher, Running Press, I said to them all, send me pictures. And they sent me thousands of pictures. And we were able to cull them and get a perfectly exciting book about hot air ballooning.
Didn't know that. Huh.
And then more recently, I wrote a book called Flying Concorde, which was based on my one trip on the Concorde from Heathrow to JFK, and which I explained. In fact, I had already written the first chapter, which described how to fly the airplane. And so when I got into the plane in Heathrow, I sent the copy of this up to the captain, and he read it apparently. And when I later got up to the cockpit to see him, he told me that it was pretty accurate. And he said the only thing that was wrong was that the elevons are never used as flaps. They're always there. There's no such thing as a flap. But anyway, so I had it pretty corrected to explain to the flying audience, the flying public, how this plane flies differently from other planes. But when I got to the cockpit, he said, okay, here, you can have, he was in the jump seat. And there was a young guy in the left seat and an older guy in the right seat, and behind him was the flight engineer. And I turned and looked. I said to the flight engineer, "Has that guy ever flown this plane before?" And he said, he broke out laughing. He said, "As a matter of fact, no, this is his first time." Of course, the plane at that time was flying itself. And the young BA pilot, British Airways pilot, was being taught by the co-pilot what was going on. It was pretty hilarious. We were at that point at 55,000 feet above the earth and flying 100 miles faster than a bullet out of a 30-30 rifle.
Wow. Amazing plane. I saw one in Costa Rica once that was chartered down there. They're a lot smaller than I thought. And I've seen the one at the museum outside of DC. But
right. That one, they won't let anybody in that museum, into that plane, because in 300 years, they say it's going to be still flyable. I doubt it, but that's what they're hoping for.
Interesting. So other flying stories that I bet you got a million of them, but any that stand out?
Well, I guess the most exciting thing has been flying seaplanes around Puget Sound. Puget Sound does have the it's Kenmore Air Harbor, which is where I did much of my flying. And they have a scheduled airline now, and they connect with Alaska Airlines in many places. And it's just a wonderful way to see the world.
So they're doing sightseeing flights, or?
Yeah, they have a scheduled airline to take people all over to various islands and such.
Oh, to the little airports.
Yeah.
Or they land in the water then, and
the water, go up to the dock. And and it's
how big are those planes? How many passengers?
Well, they vary. They did have twin otters for a while, which carried about 10 people, I guess. But then they had a caravan, which had about 10, 12 people too. And then smaller planes. Beavers are their most common. There are about 6 people in those.
Well, I hope to get up there maybe this summer if things settle down, and explore the area and catch up with you. So
good. Well, I wish I could still be flying, but we'll get you on a flight somewhere.
Yeah. What else? Looking back on your career, you think your greatest accomplishment was getting fired from the Planned Parenthood board, but what would be second?
Yeah, no, I wasn't on the board actually. I was staff, you see.
Oh, right, yeah, fired from the staff and the board.
That's right. If I had been board, that wouldn't have been a problem. But because I was staff, I wasn't allowed to talk to this board. And of course, these were my personal friends, so it was ridiculous. One of the board members was Bill Gates's father. Another was Don Collins, who also has been big on funding population efforts through the Pittsburgh Mellon Foundation. And there were many others that I knew at the time, and went to dinner with. So of course I'm going to talk to them. I mean, it was ridiculous.
Yeah. Now I remember you mentioning back when Bill Gates was funding the projects in Africa, the fraudulent 3 RCTs that we've demolished in the literature, but they still kicking around. You were considering talking to his father. Did you ever get anything through to him?
Oh, indeed, I did. Yes, but it didn't. I haven't seen any evidence that it did anything about it. Yeah. One of the other things I'm very proud of is support. I'm a co-producer of Elena Tonetti Vladimirova's film, Birth as We Know It.
Oh, right. I forgot that. Yes.
Birth as We Know It is possibly the greatest film masterpiece on birth that there has ever been made. And she did it all by herself, but I supported her in it. I think it's just an amazing work. I think that every young man and women ought to see it because it will help them if they've had a difficult birth themselves, it'll help them with that. And it will certainly help them to understand what they should be doing when they have children of their own.
Yeah.
And if people knew how an atraumatic birth, a birth without trauma, would affect the behavior of the child, they would go to the ends of the earth to have it, an atraumatic birth, because the child becomes a joy to raise instead of a brat.
Mm-hmm.
And which is so often the case when they've been traumatized from birth.
Exactly. Yeah. I'd
It's just
forgotten. Thank you for making that possible too. You're such a contribution to the world, George. I'm just delighted that I've gotten to know you, and we can share this with future generations.
It's a wonderful world. We're very lucky to have it, and I wish we'd appreciate it more. We're people young. This next generation seems to be waking up to the fact that we really have harmed it a lot, and wants to do something about it. I'm also putting out a daily good news initiative, which tells people some good news, because the radio, the media finds that bad news is what sells.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't listen to much of, I don't try not to listen to the media, and I put out good news to family and friends.
Well, can I get on that list?
Sure, sure.
Good for you. What are your thoughts about this whole COVID-19 panic and pandemic that we're right in the early stages of it at the recording here?
Yeah, well, I think that isolation is going to work to slow the rate of it's going to lower the peak of the epidemic. And that's what we're trying to do, because we want to not overwhelm the health facilities. And I think it is going to work. Someone in England said we shouldn't start this until later, until we get to where the facilities are beginning to be overwhelmed, and then we should do the isolation. But they're assuming that nobody wants to be isolated for a long period of time. I think that we're going to have to be possibly, for 8 weeks or so in order for it to work.
Uh-huh. And of course, I'm hoping I can get back to the US next month when my scheduled return is.
Right.
But it's interesting, the awareness. I was on a call yesterday with our connection group. We're all involved in attachment issues, how the awareness of our needs for connection is actually being spotlighted, and that with the absence or the decrease in it, people who aren't normally aware that this is an important human need, and we're trying to make up for it virtually, but it's actually promoting something that generally goes unnoticed and unmanifested. So it's
That's been true over the last 3 years of the presidency as well. Unnoticed has been the democracy. And
yeah.
now we're waking up to the fact that you can't have a democracy without fighting for it.
Yeah. So any final words of wisdom for future generations?
I don't know that I have any final words of wisdom. I just wish that everyone could be as lucky as I was and that happy as I have been in my life. It's, we're given these amazing bodies. We can take really no credit for them, but we have the opportunity to use them or not use them properly. And so staying in shape and staying in good health then allows us to provide health to others.
I'm just realizing that our connection group, there's a statistic people in the States believe that about 50% of people are securely attached. We think the number is more likely a single digit. And I think you're one of those people, and your life and your health are an example of what secure attachment really results in, and how little of it there is, and how much we need to change that from, as you mentioned, a non-traumatic birth, a planned pregnancy rather than surprise, and all of the things that make a childhood pleasant rather than a struggle. So you're
I think
the man.
that's true. Those of us who lucked out in that area are very lucky indeed, but it could be for all of us. That's
Exactly.
not the utopian ideal. It's simply, we have to recognize first. We have to recognize that's what we got to do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you, George. This has been a delight, and I look forward to our future contact. So
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for including me in your group. It'd be great fun to, I've enjoyed watching several of the other videos. Thank you.
okay.